Picture yourself stepping into a vast, torchlit hall where the flickering light glints off golden platters piled high with rare delicacies: suckling pig glazed in honey, figs stuffed with almonds, wine so dark it looks like liquid gemstones. The murmur of voices rises and falls in waves, punctuated by bursts of laughter and the occasional strum of a lyre. This wasn't just a party for the elite, it was a calculated performance, a stage where emperors and kings wielded food and drink as weapons of influence. These banquets were theaters of power where every bite, every toast, every extravagant display sent a clear message: we are untouchable, we are divine. You will obey. From the sprawling palaces of ancient Rome to the silk-draped courts of China's Han Dynasty, rulers understood something profound. The way to a person's loyalty wasn't just through their stomach, it was through their senses. The aroma of saffron-infused stews, the sight of towering pyramids of fruit, the sound of 100 servants moving in perfect unison, all of it was designed to overwhelm, to imprint an unshakable image of grandeur. But here's the twist: these feasts weren't just about flaunting wealth. They were psychological operations crafted to make allies feel privileged and enemies feel small. A single banquet could shift alliances, silence dissent, or even rewrite history. And the most fascinating part, these tactics aren't relics of the past. Think about the modern galas, state dinners, or even viral social media spectacles where food, ambience, and exclusivity still shape how we perceive power. The tools have changed, but the game remains the same. So how did ancient rulers turn a meal into a masterpiece of manipulation? What hidden symbols were baked into the bread, woven into the wine rituals? And why do these strategies still echo in today's world of curated experiences? That's the story we're about to unravel, one course at a time. Long before the first empires rose to power, the seeds of banquet propaganda were already taking root in the earliest civilizations. In ancient Mesopotamia, rulers hosted feasts atop towering ziggurats not just to celebrate, but to physically elevate themselves above their subjects, literally looking down from the god's domain. The menu itself became a coded language. Rare spices imported from distant lands whispered of far-reaching trade networks, while the sheer quantity of food screamed of agricultural surplus and military security. But the real stroke of genius, inviting local leaders to these events. By sharing a meal, they weren't just breaking bread, they were breaking resistance, absorbing regional power brokers into the ruler's orbit through what anthropologists now call hospitality warfare. Egypt's pharaohs perfected this art of edible intimidation. When they hosted dignitaries, the dishes weren't merely extravagant, they were alive with symbolism. A roasted ox glazed in gold dust wasn't just food. It was a walking metaphor for the ruler's divine right to tax livestock. Even the seating arrangements told a story. Foreign envoys placed closest to the throne received the message they were favored, while those positioned near the doors understood their precarious status. And then there were the Assyrians, who turned banquets into victory laps. Historical records describe tables groaning under platters shaped like conquered cities, with desserts molded into the forms of defeated enemies. One account even mentions a cake replica of a sacked capital, served with honey to symbolize the sweetness of surrender. What made these tactics so effective was their subtlety. Unlike battlefields or public executions, banquets disarmed guests through pleasure. The wine flowed freely, the music swelled, and in this atmosphere of calculated generosity, dissent melted like fat off a roasting lamb. Guests left not just full, but psychologically indebted, a phenomenon modern psychologists call reciprocity pressure. This wasn't just dinner, it was the original velvet glove hiding an iron fist. And as we'll see next, these techniques would evolve into even more sophisticated tools of control, spreading like wildfire across empires from Persia to the Andes. The guest list was the first act of psychological warfare in these imperial banquets, a carefully curated roster where absence spoke louder than presence. Take the Persian Empire's famed king's table, where the mere whisper of an invitation could make a nobleman's hands tremble. But this wasn't generosity, it was a masterclass in control. By dangling access to the empire's most exclusive dining circle, rulers turned a meal into a loyalty test. Those who received golden invitations knew their continued favor depended on unwavering support, while those left outside the palace gates were haunted by the scent of roasted meats carried on the wind, a constant reminder of what they stood to lose. The seating arrangements were even more cunning. In Rome, reclining on couches near the emperor's dais wasn't just about comfort, it was a public ranking system etched in cushions and wine goblets. Senators who found themselves edging closer to the head table over the years could trace their rising influence through these subtle shifts, while those gradually pushed toward the doors felt the cold draft of fading prestige. Byzantine emperors took this a step further, employing eunuch courtiers as seat whisperers, who adjusted placements nightly based on political winds. A sudden demotion to the lower tables could trigger panic, sparking frantic gift-giving or groveling letters to regain favor. And then there were the gatekeepers of exclusivity, the palace staff who turned away unworthy guests with practiced smiles. In Tang Dynasty China, officials barred from the mid-autumn banquet sometimes collapsed in the courtyard, knowing exclusion meant career oblivion. But rulers didn't just punish with absence, they weaponized anticipation. Mongol Khans perfected the art of delayed gratification, making ambassadors wait weeks for an audience while feasting sounds taunted them through tent walls. By the time they finally knelt before Genghis Khan's low dining table, their resistance was as tender as the boiled mutton served on silver platters. The brilliance of this strategy lay in its self-perpetuating nature. The more exclusive the banquet, the more fiercely the included fought to stay, and the more desperately the excluded schemed to break in. It created a pyramid of aspirational loyalty, where every tier of society strained upward for a taste of the ruler's favor, all while the throne sat serenely at the apex, pulling the strings of desire. Modern politicians might not distribute golden invitations, but the psychology persists from VIP cocktail fundraisers to invitation-only tech conferences where proximity to power still dictates status. The plates may have changed, but the hunger for inclusion remains the same. The most extravagant dishes served at imperial banquets weren't just food, they were theater, carefully staged to perform a political magic trick. Take the infamous peacock tongues served at Roman feasts, where hundreds of birds were slaughtered for a single delicacy that could fit on a spoon. This wasn't about taste, it was about transformation. By presenting these absurd luxuries as gifts to their guests, rulers converted blatant excess into something resembling generosity. The underlying math was ruthless. The cost of those peacocks came straight from provincial taxes, meaning the very people oohing over their plates had already paid for the privilege through backbreaking labor. Augustus Caesar mastered this sleight of hand. His legendary secular games banquets featured wines aged longer than most attendees' lifespans and seafood transported live from the Aegean in saltwater aquariums, a logistical nightmare that screamed, "Look what we can afford to waste." But the real power move came in the timing. These spectacles always followed poor harvests or military defeats, strategically distracting the elite from crises by overwhelming their senses. A senator criticizing tax hikes would find his arguments dissolving like honeyed dormice on his tongue. his indignation softened by the visceral proof of imperial munificence. China's Tang dynasty took the illusion further with their Thousand Elders Banquet, where Emperor Taizong invited hundreds of elderly subjects to a feast supposedly celebrating filial piety. The tables groaned with delicacies most peasants could never afford: shark fin soup, lotus seed buns, while musicians performed songs praising the emperor's benevolence. Yet records show the event's astronomical costs were covered by new levies on tea and salt, essentials every commoner needed. The brilliance, guests left feeling cherished rather than exploited, their complaints about rising prices now tangled up with gratitude for having tasted paradise. Even the leftovers served a purpose. At Aztec royal feasts, uneaten food wasn't saved. It was ceremoniously burned in great pyres. This wasn't waste, it was psychological warfare. As the scent of sacrificed delicacies filled the air, onlookers internalized a brutal equation. The ruler's wealth was so boundless, he could literally turn gold into smoke. Modern politicians might not torch filet mignon for effect, but the core strategy persists from corporate junkets where executives dine on shareholder-funded caviar to social media influencers, gifting luxury items to manufacture goodwill. The utensils have changed, but the recipe for manufactured gratitude remains startlingly familiar. What made this illusion so potent was its double-edged nature. For those inside the banquet hall, the message was seduction. See how much we give you. For those outside, it was intimidation. See how much we can take. Byzantine emperors took particular delight in serving dishes that cost a soldier's annual wage, like ice cream made from snow hauled down mountains by slave chains, knowing word would spread to the provinces. The extravagance became a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more subjects believed in the ruler's limitless resources, the less they dared question his right to extract them. Full bellies made for empty protests, and awe became the quietest form of surrender. Every gesture at these imperial banquets was a carefully scripted performance, turning even the simplest actions into declarations of power. When the Han Dynasty emperor raised his wine cup, it wasn't just a signal to drink. It was a meticulously choreographed moment, echoing the celestial order itself. His first sip unlocked a cascade of toasts down the ranks, each delay between cups reinforcing the hierarchy like clockwork. The message was unmistakable. Just as the moon obeys the sun, so too must the court obey his command. Aztec rulers took this symbolism to visceral extremes with their god-bread loaves shaped like bound captives, their dough limbs twisted in submission. As guests tore into these edible effigies, they weren't just eating, they were reenacting the empire's dominance with every bite. The ritual transformed conquest into something celebratory, even nourishing. Similar tactics appeared in Byzantine coronation banquets, where emperors were served dishes arranged in the shape of their monograms, turning supper into a living seal of authority. But perhaps the most ingenious use of ritual came from Persia's King of Kings. His feasts always began with the same dish, a humble bowl of barley soup, the same meal peasant soldiers ate on campaign. This calculated nod to simplicity served dual purposes. To foreign ambassadors, it whispered of the empire's disciplined might. To the Persian nobility, it was a warning: remember where power truly stems from. These traditions worked because they blurred the line between ceremony and reality. When Mongol khans distributed scraps from their plate to favored generals, the act wasn't about sharing food, it was about transferring charisma. Warriors believed the ruler's spirit traveled through those morsels, binding them to his destiny. Over generations, such rituals hardened into unshakable custom, making obedience feel as natural as breathing. The brilliance lay in their repetition. Like water wearing down stone, these symbolic acts shaped perceptions through sheer consistency. Egyptian pharaohs ensured their bread was always baked in temple ovens, so every meal became a communion with the gods. Even the direction guests faced while dining carried meaning. Incan lords sat facing east toward the rising sun, their profiles literally aligned with divine light. What makes these strategies so enduring is how they bypass rational resistance. Modern leaders still grasp this instinctively. Think of presidents tossing ceremonial first pitches or CEOs sharing staged cafeteria meals with employees. The props have changed, but the psychology remains. When power clothes itself in ritual, it stops feeling like control and starts feeling like the natural order of things. Some feasts didn't just dazzle, they paralyzed guests with calculated terror, turning banquets into psychological battlegrounds where awe and fear became indistinguishable. Take Emperor Caligula's infamous floating palace banquet, where senators reclined on couches of solid amber while a full naval battle raged just offshore. As ships shattered against each other and drowning men screamed, the emperor casually remarked that storms always improved the flavor of his wine. This wasn't mere cruelty, it was a masterclass in dominance theater. By demonstrating his power to orchestrate chaos while remaining utterly untouchable, Caligula transformed his dining room into a metaphor for imperial rule where life and death hinged on his whims. The Mongol Empire weaponized shock value with even sharper precision. When Genghis Khan hosted a victory feast for subdued rulers, the meal was served on armor stripped from their fallen kings. Each bite taken from those gilded plates carried the metallic tang of submission, a visceral reminder that resistance was literally beneath their feet. Later Khans escalated the spectacle, seating captured enemies as honored guests before unveiling surprise entertainment, their own family members in chains. These calculated reveals weren't impulsive acts of barbarism. They were meticulously timed to rupture any sense of security, proving that even at a celebration, no one was safe from the empire's long reach. Even the tableware could become an instrument of dread. At Byzantine Emperor Justinian's dinners, servants circulated with jeweled goblets, one filled with wine, another with poison. Guests never knew which they'd receive until the host gave a nearly imperceptible nod. This Russian roulette of refreshments ensured absolute obedience. A single misstep could turn the next sip into a death sentence. Similarly, Persian shahs kept guests off balance by seating them near caged lions, the beast's roars timed to punctuate political warnings. What made these tactics so devastating was their unpredictability. Unlike taxes or laws, oppressive but predictable, these spectacles kept elites in constant suspense, their nerves frayed by the possibility that today's privilege might become tomorrow's execution. Modern dictators still grasp this psychology, staging military parades during peace summits or, spontaneously, gifting luxury cars to underlings, reminders that favor is fleeting and power absolute. The banquet hall may have traded torches for chandeliers, but the shadow play of control continues, proving that sometimes the most lasting impressions aren't made through sustenance, but through sheer, calculated terror. The banquet hall became the ultimate classroom for imperial indoctrination, where eating habits were rewritten as deftly as borders on a map. When the Roman Empire welcomed Germanic chieftains to a convivium, the couches were the first trap, forcing these warriors accustomed to upright feasting into the languid recline of Roman aristocracy. The effect was immediate and humiliating. Proud men who could ride for days found themselves fumbling with goblets while half lying, their physical discomfort mirroring their eroding cultural footing. Even the serving order carried meaning. Foreign guests received wine mixed with warm water first, a Roman custom that rendered their traditional undiluted drinking barbaric by implication. Persian shahs executed a more theatrical version of this assimilation. Subject kings arriving for the Nowruz feast were instructed to bring their kingdom's signature dish, only to watch as imperial chefs improved them beyond recognition. A Babylonian lamb stew might be drowned in saffron, its original flavors muted beneath imperial luxury. The message was deliciously cruel. Your traditions are merely raw ingredients for our superior civilization. This culinary overshadowing reached its zenith when the Shah's own dishes arrived, flaming skewers of meat arranged into miniature ziggurats, each bite a reminder that the empire's palate now defined refinement. China's Tang dynasty took assimilation beyond the plate. Tributary envoys from Korea and Japan found their traditional kneeling posture replaced with chairs during banquets, while chopsticks were substituted for their native spoons. The imperial kitchens would even prepare versions of foreign dishes, but with key ingredients omitted or altered, creating a sort of gastronomic uncanny valley where familiar tastes were just slightly wrong. Over successive visits, these subtle adjustments accumulated until ambassadors found themselves craving Tang-style cuisine over their homeland's flavors, a literal internalization of imperial dominance. The most insidious aspect of these culinary colonizations was their veneer of generosity. Unlike forced haircuts or language bans, which sparked resistance, altered dining customs were framed as privileges. Byzantine emperors presented foreign delegates with gold-rimmed plates as gifts, knowing the recipients would feel compelled to use them during future diplomatic meals, gradually abandoning their own tableware. The Aztecs took this psychological hijacking further, hosting defeated rulers at banquets where every course contained chocolate, a sacred imperial monopoly. After months of such feasts, returning to a chocolate-less homeland made even mighty kings feel like paupers, their taste buds now unwitting agents of imperial nostalgia. What made this strategy so effective was its invisible timeline. Where swords and laws demanded instant obedience, the fork and spoon worked slowly, reshaping identity through repeated small surrenders. A Visigoth chief might resist Latin lessons, but after his 10th Roman-style feast, he'd unconsciously mirror the consul's dining posture. Modern parallels abound, from colonial tea ceremonies that rewired indigenous social rituals to corporate cafeterias where casual lunch meetings subtly enforce company culture. The utensils change, but the recipe remains. Make them crave your bread, and soon they'll kneel for your crown. Nothing cemented a ruler's authority like the illusion of divine catering. Egyptian pharaohs didn't just host feasts, they staged edible seances, where the menu blurred the line between mortal and god. At the Feast of the Sky, servants carried platters of roast duck straight from the temple altars, still dripping with sacred oils. Guests weren't merely eating, they were consuming offerings blessed by Ra himself, transforming each bite into a communion with divinity. The genius lay in the staging. Priests would accidentally spill wine in patterns resembling hieroglyphs, while the pharaoh's chair sat precisely where moonlight struck through temple apertures during the meal. Every detail whispered the same message. This isn't just a king's table, it's a god's dining room. Japan's imperial court perfected this celestial branding with their Daijusei harvest feast, a multi-day spectacle where the emperor's every action mirrored the sun goddess Amaterasu. Ritual sake was poured from jars shaped like her sacred mirrors, and the rice served had been grown in paddies blessed by her priests. But the masterstroke came when the emperor ate alone behind silk curtains, his unseen chewing mimicking the goddess's mythical meal that birthed Japan itself. To question his rule after participating in such sacred theater wasn't just treason, it was sacrilege. The Aztecs took divine dining to visceral extremes. When Moctezuma hosted his Flower Wars banquets, the chocolate served was whisked with blood from temple sacrifices, a drink literally pulsing with divine energy. Warriors who drank it weren't just honoring the gods, they were absorbing their power through the ruler's hospitality. This sacred cannibalism created a terrifying paradox. Rejecting the emperor's feast meant starving the gods themselves, while accepting it bound you to his holy mandate. Even the tableware became proof of divinity. Byzantine emperors commissioned plates enameled with images of Christ handing them bread, a not-so-subtle suggestion that refusing imperial hospitality was akin to refusing the Last Supper. Persian shahs went further, embedding meteorite fragments into their goblets so guests drank from pieces of heaven. These tangible connections to the divine made dissent feel like blasphemy, wrapping political obedience in spiritual dread. The brilliance of this strategy was its circular logic. The more lavish the feast, the more it proved divine favor, which then justified further extravagance. When Chinese emperors served dragon well tea harvested by virgin priestesses, they weren't just showing off, they were creating a self-perpetuating myth. After all, only a true son of heaven could command such perfection from earth and laborer alike. Modern leaders may not claim sun-goddess ancestry, but the tactic persists from state dinners in chapels to politicians posing with religious texts. The gods have changed, but the hunger for their endorsement remains. Bread and circuses, the phrase sounds almost quaint until you witness its brutal efficiency in action. When Emperor Trajan threw his 100-day feast for Rome's masses, the scale was staggering. 10,000 tables groaned under loaves baked with grain stripped from Egypt, while fountains gushed wine instead of water. But this wasn't generosity, it was a calculated trade. Full stomachs bought silence. As citizens gorged on free pastries and bet on charioteers, they conveniently overlooked the vanishing treasury or the senators disappearing into Tiber's murky depths. The genius lay in the distraction's simplicity. Why storm the palace when the palace keeps your children's bellies round? The Tang dynasty proved this strategy could be weaponized with even subtler precision. During the An Lushan rebellion, Emperor Xuanzong didn't send more troops, he sent mooncakes. These sweet pastries, stamped with the imperial seal and distributed during the Mid-Autumn Festival, became edible propaganda. Biting into the flaky crust revealed a hidden message. Rebellion meant no more lotus seed fillings next year. It was psychological judo transforming a symbol of unity into a threat wrapped in sugar. Villagers that ate the cakes found themselves paradoxically defending the very regime that had taxed them into famine months earlier. But the darkest twist: these feasts often starved the very people they pretended to feed. Accounts from Nero's reign describe peasants trampled to death scrambling for honeyed nuts tossed into crowds, while the grain dole was deliberately salted to prevent resale, forcing citizens to consume their gift or lose it. Byzantine emperors added cruel theater by having beggars compete in eating contests for rotten fruit, turning desperation into dinner entertainment. The message was clear: even your hunger belongs to us. Modern parallels lurk beneath the surface of every election year tax cut or viral fast food giveaway. When autocrats distribute sacks of rice stamped with their face or corporations drown labor protests in pizza parties, they're playing the oldest game in the book, trading temporary fullness for permanent compliance. The utensils may now be disposable and the circuses streamed on phones, but the recipe remains unchanged. Keep their mouths too full to ask why the table's set on sand. The most dangerous ingredient at any imperial banquet wasn't the exotic spices or the suspiciously glistening sauces. It was the person sitting next to you. Byzantine emperors elevated dining espionage to an art form, seeding their feasts with silent guests, courtiers trained to laugh at jokes while memorizing every loose comment. These professional eavesdroppers disguised themselves as fellow revelers, their wine cups never quite emptying, their eyes tracking who flinched when the emperor's policies were praised. The real power move, occasionally letting guests spot these spies, creating a hall of mirrors where every smiling companion might be an informant. Louis Roman XIV Versailles took this theater of paranoia to dizzying heights. His famous petit soupers were less about cuisine and more about human chess. Seating arrangements deliberately pitted rivals together, while hidden passages allowed the Sun King to observe reactions unseen. The silverware itself became a weapon. Specially designed forks with hollow handles could conceal tiny notes between conspirators, but palace staff had been trained to accidentally drop these utensils into inspection bowls. A single intercepted message could send a duke from the dining hall straight to the Bastille, but the true stroke of genius was how rulers weaponized uncertainty. Ottoman sultans would suddenly summon random guests to private tasting sessions mid-banquet, a test where declining the honor implied guilt, while accepting meant walking blind into an interrogation disguised as hospitality. Persian shahs took psychological warfare further, having servants mistakenly deliver incriminating letters to wrong recipients during dessert courses. The ensuing panic revealed alliances and betrayals like acid on parchment. What made these tactics so devastating was their self-reinforcing nature. As guests grew wary of speaking freely, their strained silence became its own form of compliance. Renaissance diplomats wrote home in code about Venetian feasts where the fish course contained literal red herrings dishes served solely to provoke reactions from certain delegates. Even laughter became dangerous. Mughal emperors noted which courtiers chuckled too quickly at their jokes, marking them as sycophants, while delayed laughers were suspected of muted dissent. Modern power players still deploy these strategies with updated tools. Corporate retreats where executives casually discuss mergers over cocktails, political fundraisers where donors are seated beside journalists. Each recreates that ancient alchemy of food and surveillance. The chopsticks may have replaced golden forks, but the game remains unchanged. Keep your enemies close, your informants closer, and never let them see you taking notes. The true cost of these imperial feasts wasn't measured in gold or spices. It was calculated in dependence. Mughal emperors played a brutal financial game with their nobility, where the invitation to host a reciprocal banquet wasn't an honor, it was an economic ambush. Imagine spending years accumulating wealth, only to be commanded to throw a feast so extravagant it would make your treasury gasp. The Mughal court kept meticulous records of each noble's expenditures, ensuring no one's display ever surpassed the emperor's, but came dangerously close to bankrupting themselves trying. This wasn't just pageantry, it was a financial leash. By the time a noble had served peacocks stuffed with emeralds literally, gemstones were sometimes hidden in dishes as surprises. Their coffers were hollowed out, leaving them scrambling for imperial favors just to stay afloat. Medieval Europe refined this tactic into a science. A lord's power wasn't just in his army, it was in his larder. The rule of hospitality turned dining halls into balance sheets. The more mouths a noble could feed, the more knights he could theoretically field. But here's the catch: the expectation was relentless. Vassals arriving for seasonal feasts would deliberately overstay, testing their lord's reserves by demanding endless rounds of ale and venison. Fail to provide, and whispers of weakness spread like spilled wine. This created a vicious cycle where nobles poured resources into maintaining the illusion of boundless surplus, even as their actual military readiness dwindled. The Ottomans added a sinister twist to this economic theater. High-ranking officials were required to host public gratitude feasts after promotions, lavish affairs funded from their own pockets. But the Sultan's spies would tally every spoonful of rosewater sherbet served, using the numbers to estimate the host's true wealth and adjust his taxes accordingly. It was a masterstroke. The more generously you celebrated your rise, the more heavily you were taxed back into submission. Even the leftovers played a role in this financial puppet show. In Renaissance Venice, doges would gift uneaten banquet delicacies to favored merchants, but these were Trojan horses of obligation. Accepting a platter of half-eaten sturgeon meant tacitly agreeing to future loans or trade concessions. The French monarchy turned this into high art with their table scraps system, where courtiers bid fortunes for the privilege of taking home the king's gnawed bones, not as souvenirs, but as collateral for social climbing. The genius of this strategy was its self-perpetuating nature. Like a rigged carnival game, the rules kept elites running in circles, spend to prove loyalty, then beg for relief from the very ruler who demanded the spending. Modern parallels lurk in plain sight, from corporate retreats where junior executives max out credit cards to keep up with partners, to political fundraisers where donations buy a seat at tables that ultimately cost far more than the meal. The currency has changed from gold-plated peacocks to stock options, but the hunger driving the game remains the same. Death was never the end for imperial propagandists. It was just another course to be served. Chinese emperors took this concept to staggering extremes, commissioning entire terracotta banquets for their tombs, not just models, but fully set tables with ceramic ducks glazed to look roasted, bowls of sculpted rice grains, even miniature wine vessels ready for the afterlife's first toast. Archaeologists uncovering these feasts centuries later made a chilling realization. Every dish was positioned to face the emperor's coffin, as if his ghost still presided over an eternal symposium. The message carved into one-hand dynasty tombs said it plainly: "Let all who serve here, in life or death, never hunger for my authority." The Maya turned posthumous propaganda into a brutal form of historical editing. When a new king rose to power, his first act was often a termination ritual, shattering the banquetware of his predecessor in a staged spectacle. But this wasn't random destruction. Specific vessels were targeted, drinking cups adorned with the old ruler's name, plates painted with his victories. Workers then methodically mixed these shards with construction fill, literally burying the past under new temples. At Capon, archaeologists found thousands of smashed ceramics beneath a stairway, each step rising atop the physical remnants of rewritten history. Even the act of eating became immortalized in some cultures. Egyptian nobles had their tomb walls illustrated with endless banquet scenes, not as memorials, but as magical insurance. Hieroglyphic captions made the purpose clear: "May these offerings sustain my car for 10,000 years." The genius was in the details. Paintings showed specific foods the deceased had taxed in life, creating a perpetual loop where their earthly exploitation funded their eternal feast. The psychological warfare didn't stop at the grave. Persian kings buried their rivals with deliberate insults, placing broken drinking horns in their tombs so even in death, they'd thirst at banquets hosted by their conquerors. Ottoman sultans took corpse diplomacy further, executing prisoners posthumously by having their skeletons propped up at mock feasts outside city walls. These grinning, decayed guests served as a warning. Resistance meant eternal humiliation, your very bones conscripted into the victor's narrative. What makes these strategies so haunting is their eerie success. When archaeologists unearthed Qin Shi Huang's terracotta army, they didn't just find soldiers, they discovered an entire subterranean kitchen staff, complete with pottery cauldrons still simmering imaginary stews. 2,000 years later, we're still piecing together his menu, still marveling at his extravagance. That's the ultimate power move, a banquet so meticulously staged, it commands awe across millennia. Modern leaders might not bury terracotta feasts, but the instinct persists from presidential libraries curated to shape legacies to billionaires funding monuments to their philanthropy. The tableware may have changed from clay to digital archives, but the hunger to control how history tastes remains insatiable. The triclinium's U-shaped embrace wasn't just about comfort, it was a physical algorithm for control, calculating status with geometric precision. Picture 3 couches arranged like a broken wheel, their open side reserved for servants who scurried in with dishes, their backs perpetually turned in symbolic subservience. The host claimed the central couch's leftmost spot, a position that forced every guest to twist their neck toward him like sunflowers to light. This wasn't accidental architecture, it was dominance by design, ensuring even a drunk senator's slurred toast would involuntarily bow in the ruler's direction. But the real psychological warfare lay in the reclining rules. Freeborn Roman men sprawled on their left elbows, a posture that required trained balance. Leaning too far back marked you as a glutton, while sitting upright betrayed plebeian roots. Women and lower status guests, they perched stiffly on the couch edges, their upright spines a living graph of exclusion. The couches themselves conspired in this theater, stuffed with increasingly luxurious materials as they neared the host, so a guest's gradual promotion up the hierarchy could be measured in cushions, from scratchy wool to Egyptian cotton infused with jasmine. Food service became a live action ranking system. Servants circulated with trays of thrush stuffed with figs, but not all beaks were equal. The host's inner circle received plump birds glazed in garum, while those near the U's outer curve got scrawnier portions, sometimes just wings or feet. Wine told the same story, first pours from aged Falanian for favorites, later cups cut with vinegar for the tolerated. The genius was in the denial's subtlety. No written rules stated who ate what, but the entire room absorbed the calculus through their taste buds. Even the act of eating reinforced the hierarchy. Reclining freed the right hand for food, but slaves stood ready with napkins to wipe greasy fingers, a service that doubled as surveillance. A guest who reached for the communal dish too eagerly might find his next invitation lost. The triclinium's true power lay in its silent pedagogy. After enough meals, elites internalized their place so thoroughly they'd police themselves, turning the architecture of oppression into second nature. Modern parallels hide in plain sight, from corporate boardrooms where chair height signifies authority to award shows where seat proximity to the stage telegraphs industry clout. The triclinium's legacy endures because its lesson was universal. Control how people sit, and you'll soon control how they think. The Persian king's table operated like a celestial clockwork, every morsel, every gesture calibrated to reinforce an unshakable hierarchy. When the Shah raised his golden fork, the entire hall froze, not out of reverence for the man, but for the spectacle of his solitude. His table stood on a raised platform, not just above the guests, but separated by a staircase of empty air, a vertical gulf that turned every sip of his wine into a performance of divine remove. Below him, the nobility received precisely measured portions, 1 pound of lamb for a satrap, 8 ounces for a cavalry commander, 4 for a foot soldier. The numbers weren't arbitrary, they were edible arithmetic, reducing each guest's worth to fractions on a scale. But the true psychological masterstroke came after the feast, when servants swept through the streets with baskets of royal gifts, leftovers from the king's plate, rewrapped in silk as if they were relics. A commoner receiving a gnawed bone or a half-eaten fig wasn't just getting food, they were being handed a fragment of the divine. Persian scribes recorded these distributions with religious fervor, noting how a baker who received a crust of the king's bread would often frame it rather than eat it, treating the stale remnant like a sacramental object. This wasn't charity, it was alchemy transforming scraps into spiritual currency. The system's brilliance lay in its illusion of intimacy. Most subjects would never glimpse the king's face, but they could taste his generosity through these carefully staged handouts. During droughts, the royal kitchens would deliberately undercook rice before declaring it unfit for the palace, then distribute the discarded sacks to starving villagers. The message was clear: even the king's rejects were superior to your best harvest. Modern food banks might frown at the tactic, but its legacy lingers in every celebrity chef's charity meal or politician's photo op with a soup kitchen. Performative giving designed to nourish reputations more than bellies. Even the tableware served as propaganda. Gold plates were reserved for the Shah, while silver signified high nobility and bronze marked the lower ranks. But here's the twist: the metals weren't just status symbols, they were surveillance tools. Persian metallurgists alloyed each tier with distinct acoustic properties. A servant could identify a guest's rank by the pitch of their knife striking the plate, ensuring no upstart secretly upgraded their place setting. The clink of cutlery became a symphony of control, each note reinforcing the social order. The most insidious effect: this system trained its victims to police themselves. Soldiers would report comrades who questioned why the king dined on roast peacock while they gnawed salted beef, not out of fear, but genuine outrage at the ingratitude. When your entire worldview is shaped by crumbs from a golden table, defending that table becomes second nature. 2 millennia later, the tactic survives in corporate hierarchies where holiday bonuses are flaunted like sacred offerings, or in influencer culture where exclusive giveaways manufacture devotion from strangers. The plates may be digital now, but the hunger for symbolic scraps remains unchanged. At the Qing dynasty's 1,000-course banquets, even the silence spoke volumes. The emperor's untouched chopsticks weren't just a quirk of etiquette, they were a living metaphor. While his ministers gnawed on bones, the son of heaven's food arrived pre-masticated by protocol, each bite placed on his tongue by eunuch attendants whose hands had been scrubbed with peach blossom water. This wasn't service, it was symbology in its purest form. To feed yourself was to acknowledge need, and the emperor could never appear to need anything. His nourishment came as effortlessly as sunlight, his satiation as inevitable as the tides. The dishes themselves were edible report cards. High-ranking officials received braised turtle, a deliberate nod to the creature's legendary longevity, implying the throne's blessing for their careers. Provincial governors got Mandarin duck, its paired serving a not-so-subtle reminder that their loyalty should mirror the bird's famed monogamy. But the real stroke of psychological genius was the shadow grading system for lower-tier guests. A military officer might find his portion of pickled cabbage arranged in precise formations, while a minor bureaucrat's rice came molded into miniature pagodas, tiny edible monuments to the precision the throne demanded. Every mouthful carried layers of unspoken critique. Your troops march sloppily, your tax records lack order, timing turned meals into metronomes of control. Courses arrived according to a guest's recent performance, delayed servings for those who displeased, creating an excruciating public spectacle of hunger. During the Qianlong era, a minister who'd mishandled a flood relief effort was made to watch as 15 courses circulated before receiving his first dish, cold congee served without accompaniments. The humiliation wasn't just the meal, it was the theater of watching others lick honey from their lips while your stomach growled. Even the leftovers played their part. What guests couldn't finish was ceremoniously bundled into yellow silk, the imperial color, and sent home with them. These gifts forced officials to confront their wastefulness while carrying physical proof of the throne's generosity through the streets. A cruel irony lurked in this gesture. The The very act of taking home uneaten delicacies became a public admission of having received more than one deserved. Modern workplaces might not wrap leftovers in branded napkins, but the psychology persists from corporate gift baskets that tacitly demand loyalty to bonus structures designed to embarrass as much as reward. The ultimate power of these feasts lay in their inescapable duality. To refuse a dish was treason, to savor it too enthusiastically, gluttony. Every guest walked a gastronomic tightrope, their chewing measured, their compliments rehearsed. In this way, the banquet table became the empire's most effective auditing tool, a place where compliance could be tasted, ambition smelled, and dissent heard in the hesitation between bites. 2 centuries later, the rituals have faded, but the instincts remain. Who controls the menu controls the narrative, and no one knew that better than the dragon enthroned at the head of the table. The medieval feast hall was a stage where power wasn't just displayed, it was chewed, swallowed, and digested. Take the infamous salt cellar, that unassuming vessel placed dead center on the Lord's table. This wasn't just seasoning, it was a social scalpel. Guests seated below the salt didn't merely get plainer food, they were served on trenchers of stale bread that soaked up their shame along with the gravy. The closer you sat to that glittering salt, the finer your pewter plate, the sweeter your wine, the more frequently servants whispered in your ear, but the real cruelty. That salt cellar was often hollow, its base stuffed with spices the lower tables would never taste, a visceral reminder that privilege wasn't just about what you received, but what you were forced to witness others enjoy. Henry Roman VIII turned his dining habits into a grotesque performance of kingship. Chroniclers describe how he'd devour entire swan pies, birds redressed in their own feathers after roasting while petitioners knelt in the rushes below. This wasn't gluttony, it was political theater. In an era when most subjects survived on coarse bread and thin ale, the king's ability to consume 8,000 calories in a sitting became proof of divine favor. His expanding waistline wasn't a health crisis, it was a billboard advertising the realm's abundance under his rule. The more his doublet strained, the more his courtiers cheered, because a king who could waste food in a starving country wasn't just powerful, he was untouchable. Architecture conspired to magnify these hierarchies. The high table's elevation wasn't just about visibility, it exploited basic physiology. Guests below had to crane their necks upward, a posture that triggered primal submission responses while making their plates appear smaller in comparison. Windows were positioned so midday sun would halo the Lord's head while leaving commoners squinting. Even the rushes strewn on floors served dual purposes. Their herbal scent masked food odors for elites, while their crunch underfoot ensured no one could approach the high table unheard. But the most insidious trick was the illusion of inclusion. When a baron hosted a public feast, peasants might receive scraps at separate trestles, but always within sight of the Lord's overflowing table. This carefully staged contrast made modest charity feel munificent. A bone tossed to a beggar became proof of benevolence when served against a backdrop of roasted peacocks. The lesson was clear: hunger wasn't the Lord's failure, it was the natural order made palatable by occasional tokens. Modern echoes of this pageantry persist in everything from corporate box seats to influencer giveaways staged beside luxury backdrops. The salt may now come in designer grinders, but the divisions it seasons remain startlingly familiar. One truth transcends centuries: control how people eat, and you'll rarely need to force them to kneel. The chocolate wasn't just bitter, it was laced with the iron tang of conquest. When Aztec warriors raised their skull-shaped cups in Moctezuma's banquet hall, they weren't merely drinking, they were swallowing the afterlife. These vessels, carved from actual enemy craniums and lined with gold, transformed every sip into a visceral communion with death. The message was unmistakable: your sustenance flows from the same violence that built this empire. But the true psychological masterpiece lay in the dining arrangements. Guests reclined on mats woven with human hair trophies from sacrificed captives, while servants circulated with platters of tamales stuffed with amaranth, a grain soaked in the blood of warriors. The symbolism was layered like the dishes themselves. Just as the gods required nourishment from human hearts, so too did the empire demand flesh to flourish. Warriors who hesitated found their portions deliberately undersized, their cups filled last, their status questioned by the very act of holding back. Even the banquet hall's architecture conspired in this theater of terror. Overhead, racks of bleached enemy bones swayed like macabre wind chimes, their hollow clattering a constant soundtrack to the feast. Murals depicted past sacrifices in graphic detail, ensuring no guest could forget the fate awaiting those who defied the throne. The genius was in the immersion. There were no breaks from the narrative, no moments where the illusion of imperial divinity wavered. The climax came with a living dessert, a cake molded into the shape of a bound captive, its chest hollowed out and filled with honey. As nobles plunged their spoons into this edible effigy, they weren't just indulging in sugar, they were rehearsing ritual heart extraction. The message was deliciously cruel. Your privilege is carved from others' suffering, and your compliance ensures it won't be your heart next. Modern parallels exist in subtler forms, from corporate retreats that glorify burning the midnight oil to militarized police banquets where officers dine beside confiscated weapons. The props have changed, but the psychology remains. Break bread amid the tools of dominance, and soon you'll mistake oppression for honor. The golden screen in Topkapi Palace didn't just hide the Sultan, it transformed him into a living rumor. Behind that shimmering barrier, every clink of his spoon became a subject of feverish speculation. Did he eat heartily to show strength, or pick at his food to suggest divine detachment? The uncertainty itself was the point. Servants delivered dishes in locked boxes, their seals broken only by the Sultan's personal taster, a man who risked his life with every bite. This wasn't mere caution, it was theater of the highest order. By making his very sustenance a state secret, the ruler turned an ordinary meal into a sacred ritual, where even the leftovers were incinerated to prevent sorcerers from stealing his essence. Meanwhile, the vizier's silence spoke volumes. Seated at long marble tables, these powerful men chewed without speaking, their eyes fixed on their plates. The rule wasn't written anywhere. That would have been too crude, but everyone knew. Laughter might suggest frivolity, debate could hint at dissent, and even casual chatter risked revealing dangerous ambitions. The only sounds were the scraping of silver and the occasional cough, a symphony of suppression conducted by invisible fear. The message was clear. At the Sultan's table, you were nourished but neutered, your voice as controlled as your portions. The seating arrangement completed this psychological chessboard. Ambassadors from Europe found themselves placed near fragrant herb gardens, their noses filled with rosemary and mint to mask any discomfort. But envoys from rival Muslim states, they dined beside the palace's execution ground, where the iron scent of blood still clung to the stones. No threats were uttered, no blades displayed, just geography doing the dirty work. A Persian diplomat once described the experience as eating with death as your tablemate, his hand shaking so violently he spilled saffron rice onto his silk robes. Even the tableware conspired in this dance of dominance. The Sultan's gold plates bore no insignia, their blank surfaces reflecting his subjects' faces back at them, a silent reminder that their identities meant nothing here. Guests drank from cups designed to spill if held too tightly, teaching them to grasp lightly or lose everything, and the coffee, always served lukewarm, so no one could mistake its offering for genuine warmth. The genius of this system was its self-perpetuating mystery. By never seeing the Sultan eat, his courtiers' imaginations ran wild. Some swore he consumed only milk and honey like a prophet. Others whispered of rare meats that granted immortality. The truth was irrelevant. What mattered was the myth, the unspoken understanding that power didn't need to show itself to be felt. Modern leaders might not dine behind golden screens, but the instinct survives in every staged photo op and carefully leaked rumor. The props have changed, but the hunger for controlled visibility remains as sharp as a palace dagger. The aroma of freshly baked bread became the battle cry of revolution. When Parisian crowds stormed Versailles in 1789, they didn't just demand political change. They ransacked the royal kitchens, carrying off silver platters still sticky with the king's uneaten brioche. But this wasn't mere looting, it was culinary theater. Weeks later, those same platters reappeared on makeshift tables along the Champs-Élysées, now piled high with coarse brown loaves labeled pain de l'égalité, bread of equality. Every crumb was a provocation, every bite an act of defiance. The revolution's great people's banquets turned dining rituals inside out. Where aristocratic feasts had emphasized hierarchy-separate tables for nobles, clergy, and commoners, these gatherings seated sans-culottes beside former magistrates on purposefully mismatched chairs. Menus featured dishes like Bastille stew, a hearty peasant pottage served in Marie Antoinette's own Sèvres soup tureens. The symbolism was deliciously crude, the people's food in the monarch's china, a tactile reminder that privilege could be repurposed. Even the act of eating became participatory. Guests took turns serving each other, transforming mealtime into a living diagram of social contract theory. Yet for all its idealism, the revolution's culinary propaganda had its own ironies. That celebrated liberty bread wasn't just a symbol, it was legally mandated. Bakers faced arrest for selling the old white loaves favored by aristocracy, their ovens requisitioned for the gritty whole grain alternative. The Committee of Public Safety even issued decrees on proper revolutionary table manners, condemning aristocratic practices like using individual forks as tools of segregation. In their zeal to erase old hierarchies, the revolutionaries created new ones, proving that no feast is ever truly free from messaging, the most subversive act. Serving wine in communion chalices looted from churches, this wasn't sacrilege for its own sake, it was a calculated fusion of sacred and secular power. As citizens drank from vessels once reserved for priests, they enacted a new liturgy, the religion of citizenship. Contemporary engravings show banquets where the Marseillaise replaced grace, and toasts honored the guillotine as the great leveler. The message was clear: the table had become an altar, and equality its sacrament. But the revolution's culinary contradictions soon bubbled over. By 1794, the same leaders who championed Spartan virtue feasts were accused of indulging in secret gourmet suppers. A Jacobin pamphlet lamented that our so-called brothers now sip turtle soup while preaching potato diets. The lesson echoed through history. Every revolution eventually gets judged by its bread, not just the symbolism of its baking, but the reality of who gets fed. From Bolshevik ration cards to modern food stamps, the struggle continues not just over who controls the feast, but who gets to define its meaning. The modern political fundraiser might lack golden chalices and roasted peacocks, but make no mistake, it's the same ancient game with a designer dress code. Picture a high-end steakhouse where lobbyists and lawmakers clink glasses over dry, aged ribeyes. The cut of meat isn't just about taste, it's a coded language. A rare steak signals boldness, a shared bottle of bourbon implies trust, and the unspoken rule that the host picks up the tab. That's reciprocity pressure straight out of a Persian king's playbook. Even the venue whispers power dynamics. A private backroom booth isn't just for privacy. It recreates the exclusivity of a medieval lord's high table, separating the decision-makers from the diners in the noisy main room. State dinners have polished the propaganda feast to a high sheen. When world leaders gather at the White House, the menu is never accidental. Serving plant-based dishes at a climate summit isn't just hospitality, it's edible diplomacy, a way to align nations without uttering a single contentious word. The seating chart is a geopolitical chessboard. Placing two feuding diplomats side by side forces them to break bread before discussing borders and the centerpieces. They're rarely just flowers. At a recent G7 dinner, the table featured wheat sheaves from each attending nation, a subtle nod to unity that would make any Roman emperor nod in approval. Corporate America has weaponized these tactics with chilling precision. Tech giants host family-style innovation retreats where executives humbly serve employees artisanal sandwiches, a performative inversion of hierarchy that still keeps the power structure intact. The message is clear: we're all in this together, but the C-suite decides what's on the menu. Even the rise of working lunches carries ancient echoes. Byzantine emperors knew that people concede more over full stomachs, which is why modern mergers are finalized between sips of $11 cold-pressed juice. The most telling evolution: social media's takeover of culinary propaganda. A viral video of a politician eating street food can ignite more loyalty than a policy paper, because a taco in someone's hand feels more authentic than a speech behind a podium. Meanwhile, influencers monetize sponsored dinners, proving that the exchange of food for allegiance now operates through algorithms instead of palace gates. From terracotta banquetware to TikTok table settings, the tools have evolved, but the hunger they feed remains unchanged. The human craving to taste power, one carefully curated bite at a time. Every bite taken together at an imperial banquet was a silent coup against rational resistance. Modern science confirms what ancient rulers intuited: breaking bread triggers a biochemical ballet that primes the brain for trust. When guests shared platters of honeyed dates in Babylon or passed communal wine cups in Athens, their bodies were quietly flooded with oxytocin, the same bonding hormone that strengthens maternal attachment and romantic partnerships. This wasn't accidental chemistry. It was culinary alchemy, turning a basic survival act into a tool of psychological warfare. The genius lay in the ritual's simplicity. Unlike speeches or decrees that could be debated, shared meals bypassed critical thinking entirely. Archaeologists studying Assyrian feast remnants found traces of fermented beverages laced with ergot, a fungus now known to enhance suggestibility. Guests sipping these doctored drinks weren't just loosening up, they were chemically primed to accept outrageous demands as reasonable. Even the seating played a role. Benches arranged knee to knee forced physical proximity, triggering the brain's social touch, responses normally reserved for intimate partners. A ruler's hand resting briefly on a guest's shoulder during dessert could feel as consequential as a signed treaty. Symbolism amplified this biological hijacking. When Mongol Khans shared a single massive roast from their personal dagger, the act wasn't just about generosity. It mimicked prehistoric hunter-gatherer customs where meat distribution cemented tribal loyalty. The brain doesn't distinguish between primal and political bonding. A noble chewing tough mutton straight from Genghis Khan's blade experienced the same neural reward pathways as a Paleolithic clansman receiving his chieftain's portion. This neurological trickery extended to sensory overload. Spices like saffron and cinnamon, chosen not just for rarity but for their ability to stimulate dopamine production, creating euphoric associations with the host's power. Timing turned meals into psychological ratchets. Roman emperors scheduled contentious policy discussions during the third course, when blood sugar levels peaked and critical thinking dipped. Byzantine records describe diplomats agreeing to unfavorable trade terms after prolonged exposure to hypnotic dessert displays swans sculpted from sugar that melted when drizzled with warm rose syrup, their dissolution mirroring the guests' fading resistance. The most effective banquets weren't those that impressed, but those that engineered a state of pliable contentment where refusal felt emotionally, even physiologically impossible. This neural manipulation casts modern political dining in revealing light. When world leaders insist on face-to-face dinners before negotiations, or corporations woo clients over multi-course tastings, they're invoking the same ancient playbook. The difference: today's hosts have clinical studies proving what their ancestors learned through trial and error, that there's no firewall between the stomach and the mind, and no persuasion more potent than a perfectly timed bite. Behind every gilded platter of roasted peacock served in Nero's palace lay a trail of empty granaries in Egypt. The mathematics of imperial feasting was brutally simple. For every senator reclining on silk cushions, 100 peasant families tightened their belts. Roman tax records reveal the chilling logistics: entire harvests from North Africa's breadbasket diverted to feed the capital's spectacle, while farmers who'd grown the grain watched their children gnaw on boiled leather during famine. The Colosseum's famous opening games featured not just gladiators, but a naval battle staged in a flooded arena using water that could have irrigated dying crops for months. The Tudor court's sugar sculptures hid even darker arithmetic. Those whimsical marzipan castles and spun sugar heraldry demanded backbreaking labor in Caribbean cane fields, where enslaved workers died faster than new shipments could replace them. A single English banquet might consume more sugar than a plantation produced in weeks, each crystallized lump representing approximately 12 hours of a child's life under the lash. Queen Elizabeth's famed sweet tooth wasn't just a personal quirk. It fueled an economy of human misery so vast that sugar became Britain's most valuable import, surpassing gold. Even seemingly benign traditions masked systemic cruelty. The Japanese imperial court's moon-viewing banquets, where aristocrats composed poetry over delicate rice cakes, relied on a hidden caste of untouchables forbidden from eating the very rice they harvested. In Versailles, the Sun King's daily public suppers, ostensibly open to all subjects, required peasants to kneel silently behind velvet ropes as course after untouched course was ceremoniously removed, a performance of waste designed to humble the hungry. The psychological violence was often more calculated than the physical. Aztec emperors forced conquered rulers to attend feasts where the main dish was their own tribute maize, ground and baked into tortilla as stamped with imperial seals. Mughal tax collectors in India hosted reconciliation dinners for villagers behind on payments, serving lavish meals on plates inscribed with the outstanding debt, a form of edible humiliation where every bite came with interest. Modern archaeology exposes these silent casualties through unexpected evidence. Soil samples from Roman latrines near the Circus Maximus show higher concentrations of rare spices than found in contemporary provincial markets, proof that the empire's luxury goods flowed overwhelmingly to the capital. Bioarchaeologists studying Tudor-era skeletons note distinct dental erosion among the wealthy from constant sugar consumption, while peasant remains show the telltale bone lesions of scurvy from vitamin-deficient diets. The banquet table's legacy is literally written in our ancestors' bones, yet perhaps the most insidious oppression was temporal. The labor required to prepare these feasts stole lifetimes that could have built civilizations. Estimates suggest the manpower behind a single medieval coronation banquet, from hunting the game to weaving the table linens, represented enough collective work hours to construct a cathedral school or irrigate a valley. When we marvel at these historical spectacles, we're not just seeing artistry, we're witnessing the ghostly imprint of stolen time, of songs never sung and inventions never conceived because human ingenuity was shackled to serving the elite's next meal. That swan glazed in gold leaf wasn't just dinner. It was an edible declaration of dominance. Ancient rulers understood something modern chefs rarely grasp. Every ingredient on a banquet table whispered secrets about power. Take the Roman obsession with flamingo tongues, a dish so rare it required the slaughter of hundreds of birds for a single platter. This wasn't culinary indulgence, it was a flex of logistical might, proving the empire could marshal fleets just to satisfy a dictator's whims. The deeper message: if Rome could deliver perishable delicacies from the Nile's distant marshes, imagine what it could do to rebellious cities. Spices became the original PowerPoint slides of imperial ambition. When Ottoman sultans served coffee brewed with Yemeni mocha beans, they weren't just offering caffeine, they were serving liquid proof of their stranglehold over the Arabian trade routes. The peppercorns floating in Byzantine stews mapped the Silk Road's contours, each black sphere representing a taxed caravan or a vassalized port. Even the color palette of dishes carried coded significance. Persian kings insisted on saffron yellow rice not for taste, but because the dye's astronomical cost, more precious gram for gram than gold, transformed each grain into a tiny, edible treasury report. Modern politicians still play this game with fork and knife subtlety. That infamous 2012 state dinner where Barack Obama served British Prime Minister David Cameron hot dogs wasn't a casual barbecue, it was culinary realpolitik. By humbling a traditional ally with America's most democratic food, the menu whispered what diplomacy couldn't say aloud. Even royalty must sometimes chew processed meat. Meanwhile, China's 8 culinary traditions, state banquets, aren't just about regional flavors, they're edible maps of assimilation, blending Tibetan yak butter tea with Cantonese dim sum to symbolize harmonious unity, whether local populations agreed or not. The most brilliant culinary codes often hid in plain sight. Aztec emperors served chocolate at victory feasts, but never with vanilla, because vanilla grew only in conquered territories, making its absence a chilling reminder of what rebels stood to lose. Medieval popes ate pike from Lake Geneva during papal elections, the fish's migratory nature symbolizing their own claimed universality. Even portion sizes lied. French kings distributed oversized bread loaves during famines, knowing the hollow center would collapse when bitten, creating the illusion of generosity while actually skimping on flour. Today's menus might trade peacock for sous vide steak, but the language remains fluent. When a tech CEO serves plant-based burgers at a product launch, they're not just being trendy, they're signaling corporate values through protein choices. That celebrity chef's locally sourced tasting menu, it's a modern version of the Assyrian king's fruit baskets, proving control over nearby farms rather than distant provinces. The fork may have replaced the scepter, but the plate still reigns as civilization's most delicious lie. The first sip was always the sweetest and the most dangerous. Assyrian kings understood this paradox better than most, serving their finest date wine in cups shaped like roaring lions, the beasts' gaping mouths pressing against the drinker's lips as if to swallow them whole. Vassals who hesitated found their cups refilled relentlessly by watchful cupbearers, while scribes lurked in shadowed corners, recording every slurred boast or careless complaint. The strategy was brutally effective. A governor who soberly denied plotting rebellion might, after the fourth pour, weepingly confessed to everything from treason to stealing the king's favorite hound. But alcohol's power wasn't just in loosening tongues, it bound hands as well. Tudor England's pledge cups turned intoxication into a loyalty test. These massive silver vessels, some holding over 2 quarts of ale, were passed among courtiers with a single rule: drink deeply or decline publicly. To refuse was to brand yourself distrustful. To drain the cup was to spend the next hour swaying before the throne like a human weather vane. Henry Roman VIII famously used these spectacles to identify dissenters. The quicker a man's wit dissolved into drunken fawning, the safer he was deemed. Yet the trap always lurked beneath the revelry. Persian feasts featured a sinister twist. The truth wine served to diplomats was deliberately mixed with herbs that amplified intoxication. Envoys who thought themselves discreet awoke to fragmented memories of revealing troop movements or mocking their own king, only to find their words repeated back to them by smirking officials. The Romans perfected the art of the drunken downfall, staging after banquet gambling sessions where inebriated senators wagered everything from villas to voting blocks. Emperor Claudius kept a team of scribes to record these drunken contracts, enforcing them the next morning with Praetorian guards. The real genius of these rituals was their deniability. A lord could claim he'd never tortured a rival for information. He'd simply shared a friendly flagon. Modern parallels abound. Corporate retreats where vodka shots grease the wheels of promotion talks, or political fundraisers where the open bar precedes the casual policy pitch. The vessel may have changed from golden goblets to crystal highballs, but the calculus remains: lower inhibitions, raise stakes, and let the liquor do the dirty work. Some hosts took the game darker. Byzantine emperors employed shadow drinkers, servants who matched guests cup for cup but secretly swapped their wine for water. While ambassadors staggered and confessed, these sober spies stayed sharp, extracting secrets like corks from bottles. The Aztecs spiked chocolate with hallucinogenic mushrooms during treaty negotiations, leaving enemy leaders so disoriented they'd sign anything to make the vision stop. Even the placement of wine servers was strategic. Ming Dynasty waiters always approached from the left, exploiting the human brain's proven tendency to underestimate quantities poured from that side. Yet for all its utility as a tool, alcohol could backfire spectacularly. Mongol Khans told cautionary tales of a general who, in his cups, challenged Genghis Khan to wrestling and woke up lashed to a horse, riding westward to certain death in an unwinnable campaign. Versailles whispered of a duchess who drunkenly mimicked Louis Roman XIV limp, only to find her estates confiscated by sunrise. The lesson echoed through every court. In the banquet hall, the drink that brought you closer to power could also drown you in its undertow. Today's power players still navigate this same tightrope where the clink of glasses masks the click of traps being set, and every toast holds the ghost of a threat. Cleopatra's barge didn't just float on water, it sailed on calculated mythology. When she welcomed Mark Antony to that legendary feast, every detail was weaponized theater. The deck wasn't merely strewn with rose petals, it was layered so thickly they muffled footsteps, forcing Antony's entourage to move like awed supplicants. The perfumed air hung heavy with crushed myrrh, a scent Romans associated with Venus herself, while Cleopatra's gown, woven with gold threads that caught the flickering lamplight, made her appear to shimmer, as if she were dissolving the boundary between woman and goddess. This wasn't seduction, it was a high-stakes identity heist where the most powerful man in Rome found himself dining not with a foreign queen, but with a divinity who just happened to serve the wine. Yet for every Cleopatra scripting her own legend, there were 1,000 women whose stories were written in someone else's ink. Take the Hellenistic royal banquets where sculpted desserts took grotesque forms, naked female figures carved from almond paste, their edible limbs arranged on platters like sacrificial offerings. These weren't just sweets, they were edible allegories, reducing real queens and princesses to consumable symbols. A Macedonian noble biting into a marzipan breast wasn't just tasting sugar, he was rehearsing dominance over the very flesh and blood women whose political influence those desserts mocked. The Byzantine court refined this gendered spectacle to chilling precision. Empress Theodora, once an actress scorned by the aristocracy, turned her coronation feast into a revenge fantasy. She seated noblewomen below salt-spitting automata disguised as decorative fountains, ensuring their silk gowns were ruined by the brine, a literal taste of humiliation dressed up as courtly tradition. Meanwhile, her own plate bore dishes shaped like the theaters where she'd once performed, a reminder that the power dynamics had irrevocably flipped. But the darkest truths lurked in the margins of these feasts. Persian shahs maintained shadow tables, where their wives and daughters dined behind translucent screens close enough to hear the men's political strategizing, yet forbidden from speaking unless addressed. The cruelty was in the illusion of inclusion. These women absorbed state secrets like sponges, only to have their insights dismissed as feminine intuition if they dared whisper advice later. Even the tableware conspired in this silent warfare. Tudor England's virgin cups, chalices engraved with chaste maidens, were reserved for unmarried noblewomen. The unspoken rule, a single sip of wine from these vessels was acceptable. A second marked you as loose. Men, of course, drank freely from plain goblets. The message was as clear as the crystal. Female virtue was always on the menu, measured by the ounce. The ultimate paradox, these very constraints birthed extraordinary ingenuity. When Chinese Empress Wu Zetian hosted her all-female poetry banquets, she replaced phallic jade wine pourers with delicate silver songbirds, their beaks designed to stream liquid into cups without a single drop splashing, a silent rebuke to masculine excess. Over in Renaissance Venice, courtesan Veronica Franco turned the obligatory dessert recital into a weapon, improvising verses so sharp they left noblemen bleeding from verbal wounds while applauding. What makes these stories so electrifying isn't just the oppression, it's the defiance baked into every subversive sip, every smuggled stanza, every rose petal strategically placed to make a Roman general forget he was supposed to be conquering, not kneeling. The banquet table may have been set by men, but the feast's most unforgettable flavors often came from the women who learned to season their revenge sweet enough to swallow. The goblet clinked against Claudius' teeth one last time, not with wine, but with a lethal dose of poisoned mushrooms slipped in by his own wife. The irony was as thick as the stew that followed. An emperor who'd survived countless assassination plots brought low at his own banquet table, his last meal a weapon turned against him. This wasn't just murder, it was culinary judo, using the empire's favorite propaganda tool as the delivery system for rebellion. Across the ancient world, feasts became battlegrounds where the oppressed fought back with the only weapons allowed at the table: wit, poison, and strategic refusal. Viking sagas recount thanes who turned mandatory toasts into thinly veiled threats, raising horns in honor of their kings while reciting verses like, "May your reign last as long as this ale stays fresh," which, given the brewmaster's skill, could be until sunrise. The genius lay in plausible deniability. Was it a compliment or a countdown to rebellion? Only the reddening king's face betrayed the truth. Early Christians weaponized abstinence with surgical precision. When Roman officials hosted unity banquets to assimilate them, believers staged mass boycotts, gathering instead in catacombs to share simple meals of bread and fish. The symbolism was explosive. Where imperial feasts boasted peacocks in gold leaf, the Christian agape meal featured the humblest fare, transforming scarcity into spiritual abundance. Authorities quickly grasped the danger. Nothing undermined propaganda faster than empty chairs at the banquet, the most subversive acts often masqueraded as compliance. Japanese courtiers during the Heian period perfected the art of the backhanded compliment, praising a shogun's banquet while conspicuously avoiding certain dishes. Everyone knew to refuse the sea bream was to reject his maritime ambitions. Leaving the rice untouched hinted at disapproval of agrarian policies. The shogun could hardly punish subtlety without admitting he understood the insult, a checkmate played with chopsticks. Even tableware became a medium for dissent. Mughal painters smuggled rebellion onto royal porcelain, decorating wine cups with scenes of peasant uprisings so tiny they went unnoticed until candlelight revealed them. Byzantine scribes wrote cookbooks with accidental errors, omitting salt from imperial recipes or tripling the pepper, knowing overconfident chefs would serve inedible dishes that made rulers appear foolish. The ultimate act of defiance, hijacking the propaganda machine itself. During the Haitian Revolution, enslaved cooks in French plantations secretly served their captors dishes laced with bitter herbs and tainted meats, while nourishing rebel forces with stolen provisions. Their masterstroke came when they openly prepared a lavish surrender feast for the French, only to reveal the main course was their own broken chains, served on plates engraved with the new republic's crest. These acts prove a timeless truth. Wherever power sets the table, resistance will find a way to rearrange the place cards, from Claudius' fatal mushrooms to the suffragettes' refusal to toast with champagne. Every oppressive feast plants the seeds of its own subversion. The first rule of culinary propaganda: never assume your guests are swallowing more than the food.